Hey everyone, if you love scary stories, hit that subscribe button and join the creepy crew. Also, don't forget to like a video and tell me in the comments what time are you watching this now. Story 1. The Curse of the Appalachian Fog. I never imagined that the mist that rolls off the ancient mountains could carry with it a curse so potent that it would mark every soul who dared to wander its lonely trails. My journey began on an overcast autumn afternoon when I decided to leave behind the frenetic pace of modern life and retreat into the heart of Appalachia. I had heard whispers of a place called Fog-Bound Hollow, a remote valley, where the fog never lifted, where time and memory intertwined like the gnarled roots of centuries-old trees. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning that once you enter the hollow, the past has a way of seeping into your very soul. The drive up to Fog-Bound Hollow was both mesmerizing and unnerving. The narrow, winding roads were flanked by towering hemlocks and oaks whose branches reached out as if to warn me away. A thick, almost unnatural fog began to roll in as I ascended the mountain, obscuring the distant peaks and casting an eerie pall over the landscape. I arrived at a dilapidated cabin that served as my temporary refuge. The cabin, with its weathered boards and sagging porch, seemed to belong to another era relic left behind by those who had long since succumbed to the hollow's strange allure. The first night was restless. I lay awake on a creaking wooden bed, listening to the constant, rhythmic whisper of the wind as it danced among the pines. There was something in the way the fog pressed against the windows, a soft, insistent tapping that seemed almost deliberate. At first, I dismissed it as the sound of rain, but as the night deepened, the noise grew into a patternless series of measured knocks that echoed through the silence. I could almost make out words within the tapping, fragments of a message too faint to decipher, yet filled with an unmistakable sorrow. In the following days, I set out to explore the hollow. I trekked along narrow trails that wound through dense undergrowth and over mossy rocks, my every step accompanied by the sound of crunching leaves and the distant murmur of a hidden stream. The fog clung to me like a second skin, and it was impossible to tell where the trees ended and the mist began. Along the trail, I encountered remnants of a bygone era-rusted farm equipment, broken fences, and faded photographs scattered on the ground as if discarded by time. At one point, I found an old gravestone partially buried in the dirt. Its inscription was worn beyond recognition, yet I felt an overwhelming sense of loss as I knelt to trace the faint letters with trembling fingers. Everywhere I looked, there were signs that the hollow held secrets too heavy for the living to bear. I began to notice odd phenomena, a sudden chill that seemed to emanate from nowhere, shadows moving independently of any light source, and the persistent feeling that I was being followed by unseen eyes. One afternoon, while resting by a babbling creek hidden deep within the forest, I heard a voice that sent shivers down my spine. It was soft at first, a barely audible murmur that blended with the sound of water over stones, but as I strained to listen, it became clear. The voice was calling my name, urging me to remember and forgive. I searched the surrounding trees, but found no one. Had the hollow reached out to me in the guise of an echo from the past? Determined to understand the source of these unsettling experiences, I began to speak with a few locals who still live near Fog-Bound Hollow. An elderly woman, her eyes clouded with memory, told me of a legend passed down through generations. She spoke of a young woman named Annabelle, who had once lived in a small farmhouse on the edge of the hollow. Annabelle was said to have been a kind soul, beloved by all, until a series of tragedies befell her lost love, a family torn apart by grief, and the mysterious disappearance of her only child on a foggy night, much like this one. The locals believed that Annabelle's sorrow had become so potent that it had cursed the land. The fog that rolled in from the mountains carried her anguish and the voices of all the broken hearts that had come before. Once you hear the whisper of the hollow, the woman warned, it will haunt you until you confront your own regrets. That night, I could not sleep. I sat by the cracked window, watching the fog slowly consume the landscape. In the dim light, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, a pale, forlorn face, framed by dark, unruly hair. The figure seemed to beckon me, its eyes filled with an indescribable sorrow that mirrored my own hidden grief. I called out softly, "Who are you?" But the only response was the sound of the wind and the distant, repetitive knocking that had first stirred my fears. I reached for my journal and began to write, desperate to capture every detail, every emotion that surged through me. The words flowed feverishly as I recounted the stories of the Hollow and the legend of Annabelle. In that moment, I felt as if the fog was not merely an atmospheric phenomenon, but a living Intidian echo of every heartbreak and every lost promise, reaching out to those who dared to listen. As the days turned into a week, my time in Fogbound Hollow became a journey of both revelation and torment. The fog thickened, sometimes so dense that I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. I continued to explore, venturing deeper into the forest, where the very air seemed charged with sorrow. In one forgotten clearing, I found an old, crumbling church. Its doors hung ajar, and inside, the pews were covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. I walked slowly down the aisle, each step echoing in the silent sanctuary, until I reached the altar. There, on a worn, faded cloth, lay a single red rose, as if placed there by a grieving hand. I picked it up, feeling its softness and the weight of unspoken promises, and for a moment, I could almost hear a voice whisper, "Remember me." The encounters grew more frequent and intense. I began to see reflections in every window that did not belong to me, faces of strangers, with eyes full of despair. At night, I heard footsteps pacing outside the cabin, and sometimes the gentle sound of a lullaby drifting on the window melody that filled me with both comfort and dread. I could no longer separate the living from the dead, the present from the past. The Hollow was speaking to me in a language of loss and forgiveness, urging me to confront the mistakes I had long buried deep within my heart. One particularly stormy evening, as rain battered the roof and lightning illuminated the jagged outline of the mountains, the full force of the Hollow's curse revealed itself. I was huddled in the cabin, trying to muster the courage to leave, when the knocking began anew louder, more insistent than ever before. It seemed to come from every wall, every crevice of the old building. In that moment, I felt the presence of something ancient and sorrowful, a force that demanded acknowledgement. The knocking morphed into a cacophony of whispers, voices overlapping, each telling a story of loss, regret, and the endless passage of time. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me, feeling as though I were being drawn into a vortex of memories. When I finally opened my eyes, I saw in the murky reflection of a rain-streaked window a vision of Annabelle, her eyes brimming with tears, her lips moving silently as if speaking a message meant only for me. In that instant, I understood that the curse of Fogbound Hollow was not something imposed upon the land from without, but rather a manifestation of the collective sorrow that resided in each of us. The fog, the knocking, the spectral figures all were echoes of pain, reminders that no matter how far we run, the past will always find us. I left Fogbound Hollow a changed man. The memories of that place, with its endless mist and sorrowful whispers, remained etched in my Sula-haunting reminder that some curses are eternal, that the echoes of lost love and unspoken grief can never truly be silenced. I now share this tale not as a boast or a challenge, but as a solemn warning. If you ever find yourself drawn to the forgotten corners of the world, where the mist clings to ancient stones and the wind carries voices from another time, tread carefully. For in those quiet, haunted places, the past is never dead. It lives on in every heartbeat, every whisper, every knock in the dark. Story 2. The Sorrow of Hollow Creek. There is a valley in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness where the water runs as cold and dark as Sorrow Place known as Hollow Creek. The legends surrounding this remote glen speak of a curse that has haunted its banks for generations, a lament of lost souls and broken promises that reverberates through the ages. I had always been fascinated by the mysteries of nature, by the hidden stories etched into the landscape. So when I first heard of Hollow Creek, I knew I had to experience it for myself. I journeyed to this secluded valley, leaving behind the comforts of modern life to embrace the raw, unfiltered beauty of Appalachia. My arrival at Hollow Creek was marked by an almost tangible heaviness in the air. The narrow road that wound its way through towering pines and rugged cliffs eventually led me to a modest cabin perched on the edge of the creek. The cabin, though small and time-worn, offered a window into a simpler Herrera place where nature ruled supreme and every sound told a story. The first evening, as I sat on the creaking porch watching the sun dip below the distant mountains, I noticed the creek shimmering in the twilight. Its waters, clear and dark, seemed to mirror the sky, and the sound of its gentle murmur was oddly hypnotic. That night, sleep came fitfully. I lay awake, listening to the chorus of nocturnal sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and, most unsettling of all, a steady, deliberate tapping that echoed from somewhere deep in the valley. It was not the sound of nature, but a pattern that seemed almost too rhythmic to be accidental. I could have sworn that the taps formed a series of numbers or words, though I could not decipher them. In the flickering light of a single lantern, I opened my journal and scrawled down the experience, feeling a mix of fear and fascination. Hollow Creek was not merely a scenic retreat, it was alive with secrets, a repository of sorrow that beckoned the brave and the desperate to uncover its truth. In the following days, I explored the valley with a mixture of trepidation and determination. I followed the meandering path of the creek upstream, where the water flowed more rapidly, carving its way through the ancient bedrock. Along the banks, I discovered remnants of a long-forgotten past. A rusted locket half buried in the mud, a broken pocket watch with its hands frozen in time, and a series of small, unmarked gravestones that seemed to whisper names I could not recall. Each discovery filled me with an overwhelming sense of melancholy, as if the very soul of the valley were crying out for recognition. I began to hear soft whispers carried on the wind, voices that sounded like lamentations, pleading for someone to remember them. One day, as dusk settled over the valley and the fog began to rise from the creek like a living shroud, I came upon a clearing where the water pooled into a small mirror-like lake. The surface was unnervingly still, broken only by the occasional ripple that spread like a secret. I knelt by the edge and peered into the depths, and for a moment, I thought I saw the faint outline of a face, its expression one of profound sorrow. The sight was both beautiful and horrifying, as if the lake itself held the memories of every tear ever shed along its banks. I could feel my heart tighten with grief, as though I were absorbing the pain of the past. As night fell, the valley transformed into a realm of haunting beauty and unbearable loneliness. I returned to the cabin and sat by a dying fire, the flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The steady tapping resumed, now louder and accompanied by a low, mournful hum that resonated deep within me. In that moment, I realized that Hollow Creek was calling me to confront its legacy, a legacy of love lost, lives cut short, and a sorrow that had never been allowed to fade. I spent hours recording the sounds, transcribing the faint murmur of numbers and names that seemed to echo from the depths of the water. It was as if the creek were trying to tell its story, to reveal the secrets of those it had claimed over the decades. I delved into the local history, speaking with the few remaining residents of the area, and piecing together fragments of forgotten lore. They told me of a young woman named Lillian Hart, whose life had been marked by tragedy. Lillian had once been the light of the valley, a vibrant soul whose smile could outshine the sun. But a series of misfortunes had driven her to despair, and one fateful night she had wandered into the creek, never to be seen again. Her story became interwoven with the very fabric of Hollow Creek, and many believed that her restless spirit lingered on, mourning the loss of a life that had been stolen by fate. The whispers I heard on the wind, the rhythmic tapping that haunted my nights, all seemed to carry the weight of her sorrow. One stormy evening, as rain pounded the roof of the cabin and thunder rolled across the mountains, I ventured out to the creek once more. The sky was a tumult of dark clouds, and the valley was cloaked in an oppressive gloom. I followed the sound of the tapping to a narrow footbridge that spanned the creek. Standing in the middle of the bridge, I felt the full force of the valley's grief. The water below roared with the fury of the storm, and the tapping intensified, as if the very heartbeat of the valley had quickened. In the midst of the cacophony, I heard a single, clear word whispered on the wind. Remember. The word echoed in my ears, a command and a plea, urging me to never forget the pain that had seeped into every stone, every tree, every ripple of the water. In the weeks that followed, the experience at Hollow Creek left an indelible mark on me. I continued to record the strange sounds and document every eerie encounter, determined to piece together the puzzle of the valley's curse. But the more I learned, the heavier the burden of sorrow became. I found myself haunted by dreams of Lillian Harda's spectral figure with eyes full of unspoken grief, her voice mingling with the sound of the creek. I awoke each morning drenched in sweat, the memories of that stormy night and the whispered command seared into my soul. Hollow Creek, with its ghostly beauty and relentless sorrow, had become a part of me, a living reminder that some places are so steeped in tragedy that they forever alter the hearts of those who visit. I eventually left the valley, returning to a life that was forever tinged with melancholy. The images of the fog-shrouded creek, the echoing taps, and the spectral face in the water continued to haunt me, a constant reminder of the pain that the land had absorbed. I share this story not as a means of entertainment, but as a testament to the enduring power of grief and memory, a cautionary tale for those who seek solace in the quiet, forgotten corners of the world. For in places like Hollow Creek, the past is never truly gone. It lingers in the mist, in the sound of the water, and in the echoes of every heart that has been broken. Story 3. The Night the Shadow Spoke. Deep in the rugged, untamed wilderness of Appalachia, where the night seems eternal and the darkness conceals more than it reveals, I experienced an encounter that defied every law of nature. It began on an evening when the sky was an inky canvas, and the only light came from a pale, waning moon that cast ghostly shadows across the land. I had taken a temporary job as a night guard at an old hunting loggia crumbling structure that once served as a retreat for those seeking to embrace the wild, raw beauty of the mountains. The lodge was isolated, surrounded by dense forest and steep slopes, a place where every creak and groan of the building resonated like a forgotten lament. That first night, as I patrolled the dim corridors of the lodge, I felt a persistent sense of unease. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant call of an owl and the occasional rustle of leaves. Yet somewhere in the periphery of my vision, I began to see movement, a subtle flicker, a wisp of a shadow that seemed to dance along the walls. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than a trick of the light or the result of fatigue. But as the hours passed, the movements became more distinct, more deliberate. I could make out the shape of a figure tall gaunt, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness, moving silently from one end of the corridor to the other. I tried to follow it, but every time I turned a corner it vanished, leaving only an echo of footsteps and a lingering chill. I began to document these occurrences in a journal, writing down every detail with mounting apprehension. The entries filled with descriptions of soft whispers, the rustling of fabric that sounded like a breath in the dark, and the sensation of being watched from every shadow. I noticed that the phenomenon seemed to intensify near the large, broken windows that overlooked the dense forest. One night, while I stood in the corridor near a window, I swore I heard a voice so faint and distant that it might have been the wind murmuring my name over and over. "Samuel, Samuel," it called, its tone both gentle and desperate. I froze, heart pounding, and turned to see if I could locate the source, but the corridor was empty, and the only sound was the soft hum of the old heating system. Driven by both terror and a need to understand, I decided to investigate the source of the disturbances. I retraced my steps to the main lounge, a cavernous room filled with remnants of a bygone era-old hunting trophies, faded photographs, and a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall. As I approached the fireplace, I noticed something strange. In the reflective surface of a dusty mirror that hung above the mantel, I saw not only my own reflection, but that of a figure standing directly behind me. The figure was blurred, almost translucent, yet its eyes shone with an otherworldly light. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. The shadows in the lodge were not merely tricks of the light. They were alive, moving with a purpose and intent that defied explanation. The nights grew longer and more oppressive. I began to see the spectral figure in my peripheral vision even during the day, its form merging with the natural shadows cast by the gnarled trees outside. I would catch glimpses of it in the reflection of water in the tarnished mirror of an old clock, or in the darkened surface of a window pane. Every sighting left me with a deep, aching dread, as though the figure was reaching out to me, beckoning me into a realm beyond understanding. I felt an inexplicable connection to it, a sense that it carried a message, a burden of sorrow and warning that I was meant to decipher. Determined to confront this relentless presence, I set up a makeshift observation post in the lounge. I arranged an array of old cameras and audio recorders, all aimed at the mirror above the fireplace. For hours, I sat in the flickering light of a solitary lamp, watching and listening as the night unfolded around me. The recordings captured an array of inexplicable sounds of faint, repetitive tapping that matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat, whispers that seemed to speak of loss and longing, and the occasional sound of a soft sigh, as if someone were exhaling centuries of sorrow. At one point, I heard a clear phrase in the recording: "Do not forget, do not let go." The words sent shivers down my spine, and I knew that the phenomenon was not random, but a deliberate echo of a long-forgotten past. Over the ensuing weeks, I immersed myself in the history of the lodge and its surroundings. I discovered that the building had once been owned by a reclusive hunter named Jeremiah Cole, a man who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances decades ago. Local lore held that Jeremiah had been tormented by grief after the loss of his only daughter, and that in his despair, he had made a pact with forces beyond the mortal realm to find a way to speak with her again. Some claimed that his spirit still lingered in the lodge, his sorrow manifesting as a spectral figure I now saw in the shadows. I combed through old newspaper clippings, court records, and even the faded diaries of former residents, each piece adding to the chilling mosaic of the lodge's history. The deeper I delved, the more I realized that my encounter was part of a larger, inexplicable tragedia continuum of loss that had seeped into the very walls of the building. One night, as a bitter wind howled outside and the rain lashed against the broken windows, I found myself standing in the middle of the lounge. The cameras captured nothing unusual, yet my heart pounded as I felt a sudden, overwhelming presence behind me. I slowly turned, and there, in the dim glow of the dying lamp, stood the figure once more. This time, it was unmistakably a tall, gaunt silhouette with eyes that burned like embers, its expression one of profound grief and pleading. It raised a hand as if to beckon me closer, and in a voice that was both mine and not mine, it whispered, "Remember your pain, remember your loss." In that moment, the boundaries between my own memories and the sorrow of the lodge blurred until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. I left the lodge that morning with my mind reeling and my soul forever changed. The spectral figure, the persistent whispers, and the relentless tapping had etched themselves into my memory like a scar that would never fade. I returned to my everyday life, but at night, when the world fell silent, I could still hear the echoes of that haunted place. I now share this story as a warning to those who seek answers in the darkness. Sometimes the price of uncovering the past is far greater than you can bear. The shadows that linger in forgotten places are not content to remain hidden. They will reach out and claim you, piece by piece, until your own memories become lost echoes in the void. Story 4. The Whispers of Pine Ridge. I had long heard the legends of Pine Ridge, a hidden valley deep within the Appalachian Mountains, where the ancient pines seem to murmur secrets to those who dare to listen. Drawn by a need to escape the clamor of modern life and a restless yearning for solitude, I set out on a chilly autumn day, determined to discover the truth behind the eerie tales whispered in nearby towns. The journey was as treacherous as it was beautiful. Winding mountain roads flanked by gnarled trees and shrouded in mist, each bend in the road hinting at mysteries left untold. As I approached Pine Ridge, the landscape grew wilder, the silence more profound, and an unsettling chill seeped into my bones. I arrived at a small, weathered cabin nestled at the edge of the ridge relic of a bygone era, whose wooden siding was scarred by decades of relentless Appalachian winters. The cabin exuded a quiet melancholy, as if it were a repository for the sorrows of generations past. Locals claimed that those who stayed here often left with nightmares and a lingering sense of loss, but I dismissed such warnings as superstition. I needed solitude, a place where I could reflect, and Pine Ridge promised just that. I unpacked my few belongings in a sparse room with peeling wallpaper and a single grimy window that overlooked a sea of towering pines. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and resin, mixed with a subtle tang of something indefinably old of fragrance that set my nerves on edge. The first night passed in uneasy silence. I lay in bed listening to the constant rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the old structure. Yet, as the hours deepened into darkness, I began to notice a peculiar sound, a soft, deliberate tapping echoing from somewhere beyond the walls. At first, I assumed it was simply the building settling, but the rhythm was too measured, too persistent. It echoed in a pattern that felt almost like a message. 3 rapid knocks followed by a slow, lingering pause. My heart pounded with a mix of curiosity and dread, and I resolved to uncover the source of the sound. At dawn, I stepped outside onto the creaking porch, where the fog was just beginning to roll in from the valley below. The world was muted, as if covered by a thick, ethereal blanket. I followed a narrow trail that led down into the forest, the rhythmic knocks still echoing faintly in my ears. The trail wound through ancient groves of pine and hemlock, their towering silhouettes dissolving into the mist. As I walked, I noticed strange symbols carved into the bark of some trees, patterns that resembled archaic runes. They seemed to pulse under my touch, as though the trees themselves were alive with forgotten memories. Hours later, I reached a clearing where a narrow, slow-moving stream cut through the dense forest. The water was as dark as obsidian and perfectly still, mirroring the cloudy sky above. I knelt by the edge and listened to the silence broken only by the sound of the tapping, now accompanied by faint, almost imperceptible whispers carried on the breeze. I could not decipher the words, but they carried a profound sadness, as if pleading for remembrance or forgiveness. My mind raced with questions. Were these the voices of those long lost? Or was the land itself crying out its own sorrow? I scribbled frantic notes in my journal, desperate to capture every detail. Over the following days, the strange occurrences grew bolder. While exploring the ridge, I discovered remnants of a life once lived, a rusted tin box half buried in the underbrush, an old photograph of a smiling woman whose eyes held an inexplicable grief, and a broken locket with a faded inscription that read simply, "Remember." Each artifact seemed to hum with an energy that resonated with the desolate beauty of the valley. At times, I swore I could hear soft humming in the distance, a melody that shifted with the wind and carried the weight of centuries. At night, the tapping would intensify, echoing off the cabin walls in a relentless refrain that left me awake and trembling. Driven by a mixture of terror and a need for answers, I sought out the few locals still living near Pine Ridge. I visited an old general store in a nearby town, where an elderly man with eyes clouded by memory recounted the legends of the valley. "Pine Ridge isn't just a place," he whispered, leaning close as if sharing a secret meant only for those brave enough to listen. "It's a living chronicle of sorrow and regret. The pines carry the voices of the lost, and the fog is their shroud. If you hear the knocks, it means the past is calling you to remember, to atone." His words sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was now part of that eternal cycle of loss. One particularly bitter night, as a storm gathered strength and the wind howled through the mountains, I sat by a dying fire inside the cabin. The rain lashed against the window, and lightning illuminated the dark silhouettes of the pines outside. In the midst of the tempest, the rhythmic tapping returned, louder and more insistent than ever before. I stepped outside into the storm, the cold rain biting at my skin, and followed the sound to a narrow footbridge that spanned a deep chasm carved by a forgotten creek. Standing in the center of the bridge, I felt as though the very heartbeat of the valley pulsed through the ground beneath me. The tap seemed to form words that echoed in a voice that was both sorrowful and commanding. Remember me. In that moment, a vision flashed before my eyes. A pale figure in an old-fashioned dress, her eyes brimming with tears, standing on the opposite side of the chasm. I reached out as if to grasp her, but she vanished into the swirling rain and fog, leaving only the echo of her plea in my ears. Haunted by the vision and driven by a relentless need to understand, I spent every available moment exploring the valley. I returned to the old forest paths, retraced the steps I had taken that stormy night, and documented every subtle sound and shifting shadow in my journal. I discovered that the symbols carved into the trees matched designs found in an old family Bible from a local church, hinting at a long-forgotten ritual or curse. I learned of a young woman, Annabelle, who had once lived in a farmhouse near Pine Ridge. According to legend, Annabelle had lost her only child on a foggy night and had wandered into the forest, never to be seen again. Her sorrow was said to have imbued the valley with an everlasting melancholy, and her spirit, along with those of others who had suffered similar fates, now whispered through the pines. As days blurred into nights, my experiences at Pine Ridge became a study in both beauty and horror. The valley was at once breathtaking and unbearably sought a place where every rustling leaf and every gust of wind carried the weight of untold grief. I felt as if I were caught between two worlds, the tangible world of rugged mountains and cold stone, and a spectral realm of memories and echoes that defied explanation. I began to sense that I too was being marked by the valley. My dreams were invaded by visions of Annabelle and countless other lost souls, their voices merging into a single mournful chorus that demanded that I remember and somehow atone for the past. One evening, as the sky darkened into a velvety expanse and the fog thickened to a near impenetrable wall, I sat in the cabin and listened. The tapping returned once again, now accompanied by a soft, harmonious melodiah lullaby of sorrow that seemed to emanate from the very ground. I closed my eyes and let the sounds wash over me, feeling as if I were being drawn into a ritual of remembrance. In that suspended moment, the cabin walls seemed to dissolve, and I found myself surrounded by the ghostly figures of those who had once called Pine Ridge home. Their faces were etched with sorrow, their eyes filled with a longing that transcended time. They whispered words I could not fully understand, words that were both a lament and a plea. Remember, forgive, let go. I felt their voices seep into my soul, binding me to the valley in ways I could neither fathom nor escape. I left Pine Ridge eventually, burdened with more questions than answers, and with a heart heavy with the collective sorrow of the valley. The images of the fog-clad forests, the spectral figure on the footbridge, and the rhythmic, insistent tapping still haunt my waking hours and invade my dreams. I returned to my ordinary life, yet the memory of Pine Ridge remained a permanent scar on my soul, a reminder that some places are so steeped in grief that they change you, leaving you with echoes of the past that can never truly be silenced. I share this tale not to frighten, but as a cautionary reminder. If you ever find yourself drawn to the forgotten corners of the world, where the mists cling to ancient trees, and every sound seems to carry a hidden sorrow, tread carefully. The whispers of Pine Ridge are not mere legends. They are the voices of those who have been lost, pleading to be remembered, and sometimes, in seeking the truth, you may find that the past has claimed you too,